Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Laura Dierda with Becker's ASC Review. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Top 10 Best Practices to Maximize Complex Out-of-Network Reimbursements and Drive Payer Accountability, sponsored by CollectRx. Our webinar today will be about 30 minutes. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we will be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenters. John Bardis serves as CollectRx's Chief Executive Officer. Mr. Bardis is a veteran in the field of healthcare and information technology. As president of Dr. First, Inc. and executive vice president of Pragmatic, Mr. Bardis has specialized in providing cost containment services to health insurers and various products and services to hospitals, health systems, and other healthcare providers. Previously, Mr. Bardis was an attorney with Kirkpatrick & Lockhart LLP, now K&L Gates, where his practice focused on litigation. Mr. Bardis's clients have included a wide range of for-profit and not-for-profit health insurers, including Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida, Humana, Capital Blue Cross, Kaiser Permanente of the Mid-Atlantic region, Care First, and Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. Mr. Bardis has also worked on behalf of numerous hospitals and health systems, including Henry Ford Health System and MedStar Health, along with hundreds of physician practices. Richa Singh brings 10 years of revenue cycle experience to her role at CollectRx. In this role, she has focused on enhancing out-of-network reimbursements to ASCs, physicians, hospitals, labs, and behavioral health centers. She specifically played a key role in the growth of the firm, which now has a client base of more than 800 U.S. providers. John, I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Laura. We appreciate it. Again, I'm John Bardis, CEO of CollectRx. I'm joined here today by Richa Singh, our Executive Vice President. And our webinar today is on the top 10 best practices to maximize complex out-of-network reimbursements and drive payer accountability. And we're excited to be here today to talk to you about that and the opportunities to leverage out-of-network to increase your revenue and make 2019 your best year ever.
All right, great. So for today's agenda, we'll start with a background on CollectRx and our out-of-network experience so you understand why we're in a position to discuss this. Then we'll talk about the market trends driving out-of-network. We'll get into the top 10 best practices. And lastly, we'll walk you through building a plan that works for you. So our goal today when we're done is to provide you with some of the best practices to successfully maximize out-of-network reimbursements and drive payer accountability.
Before we discuss planning for 2019, let me spend a couple of minutes explaining who we are, our experience in this area, give you an idea of why we're in a position to address these issues. So simply put, what we do here at CollectRx is we help providers get higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. We don't do this as consultants, we do it as experts, negotiating higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. You can think of us as your prescription for higher out-of-network payments. CollectRx is an innovator in data-driven products and services for healthcare providers' most complex billing issues. As such, CollectRx is the only company in the country that's laser-focused on maximizing out-of-network collections for providers, thus reducing patient billings and eliminating the hassle of dealing with insurance companies. We've delivered proven results for more than 800 customers nationwide. That includes surgery centers, physician practices, hospitals, and substance abuse centers. Our unparalleled expertise comes from processing on an annual basis over $1 billion in out-of-network bills. And over the years, we've built a team of people with deep experience in understanding what the payers are doing to lower your out-of-network reimbursements. The expertise comes from having worked for these organizations and knowing the soft spots to push to get higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. And in addition to our expertise, the other key to our success is what we call our CRIXIS Business Intelligence Engine. CRIXIS stands for CollectRx Information System, and it's the data and analytics tool we've developed here internally to help us counteract what the payers are doing to reduce payments for out-of-network bills. CRIXIS allows us to do things like analyze actual policies from insurance companies throughout the country to determine what is reasonable and customary. It also provides us with an incredible amount of comparable data because we're aggregating data and results from the hundreds of customers that we service. We use those data and analytics to compare our determination of reasonable and customary with the payer, and in many instances, we're able to identify holes in their data and convince the payer to increase payment. Our database that captures business intelligence about the tendencies and trends of the people on the payer side. And our experienced team knows who to speak to at each of these companies, and we have the ability to go to senior personnel at the payer, and sometimes they're the only ones that have the authority or ability to get higher payments to providers. Our engine combines all of this data to suggest best case results, and if you'd like more information about us, you can visit us at www.collectrx.com. Richa?
All right, thanks, John. So some of what we're going to discuss today may include words that are unfamiliar to everyone, or you might even just use a different terminology for that same idea. So before we dive into these best practices, I'd like to provide definitions of some of the concepts that are used today. So first off, I always start with out-of-network, and it does sound like it's a basic term, but providers that take a mostly in-network position, they might not be completely aware of what it encompasses. So a provider that's out-of-network with a payer, they have not negotiated a contracted rate for reimbursement. When a patient with that insurance is treated, the bill the provider sends to the payer is an out-of-network bill. The next term here is payer, and we're going to be using this term throughout the presentation to refer to the insurance company. And then finally on this slide, we have reprice. This is when a payer reimburses a provider at an amount that is different than the provider's full bill charges, and it's usually at a much lower amount. Next up, we have vendors. So these are third parties that insurance companies use to reduce payments to providers, known as bill minimization tactics. So payers either outsource these tactics to vendors by negotiating high discounts from providers or repricing their claims to very low amounts. Single case rate agreements. So people refer to this in a lot of different terms. Settlement offers, proposals, LOAs, which are letters of agreement. And a payer, what they do is they send a payment offer after services are provided and after the patient leaves the facility, but before the insurance company makes the payment. Now, in return, the provider may not bill the patient for that discounted amount that they agree upon with the vendor on any of these single case rate agreements. And then finally, discounts. I've already used it a couple times, but what I mean is that it's the amount off the bill charges that the provider and the payer agree upon in the single case rate agreement. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about trends in out-of-network right now. There are a lot of developments across payer, patient, and provider segments that are important to consider as you're building your reimbursement strategy. Now, the first and the most important trend to consider is the increasing complexity of the entire function of healthcare billing and reimbursement. So across all payers, we're seeing what looks to be an almost intentional strategy to build additional complexity in the system to create a more payer-friendly environment. So the first trend that we're seeing with respect to complexity is with denials. And this is whether you're out-of-network, in-network, or Medicare. Although denials might come to surprise, have gone down in recent years, we anticipate these will increase in 2019 as the payers fight to drive more costs out of the system. Now, a report in last year's October report from Human Health Services Office of the Inspector General, I'll call it the OIG, they even went so far as to suggest that Medicare Advantage plans, they could be denying needed medical services just to maximize profits. But that being said, most providers, they don't appeal these denials because they're complex and it requires a lot of man hours. Now, that same report from the OIG, they found that Medicare Advantage plans overturned 75% of their own claim denials, indicating possible improper payment and care denials. But that same report also showed that only 1% of Medicare Advantage prior authorizations and claim denials are appealed, even though 75% of those appeals were overturned. So there's a lot of opportunity there. In another example, Affordable Care Act marketplace plans, they denied 19% of claims submitted for in-network services in 2017. But only 0.5% of those denied claims were appealed, according to a Kaiser Family Foundation report. So numerically speaking, only about 200,000 of the almost 43 million denied claims were appealed. And finally, Change Healthcare. Last year, they analyzed 3.3 billion hospital transactions valued at $1.8 trillion, and they found that 9.8% of claims were denied. They also found that while 63% of denied claims are recoverable on average, appeals cost providers roughly $1,182 per claim, or as much as $8.6 billion in administrative costs nationally. So the reason that providers give for not appealing, well, it's cost and it's complexity. Now, insurance companies, they have creative policies, they've designed plans, and they've narrowed provider networks to bring down healthcare costs. More and more, plans across all types of payers are working to drive patients and providers into these narrow networks that keep provider reimbursements are artificially low. And evidence suggests that, they've been successful. So you can expect payers to accelerate those programs and policies and search for more cost-saving levers, including pushing for more services outside of the hospitals, which obviously means more for ASCs. Now, whether in-network or out-of-network, consumer-driven healthcare plans mean more patients' obligation. According to AHIP, as of January of 2017, 21.8 million people were enrolled in HSAs. This represents an overall increase of nearly 1.7 million enrollees since the year before. And the majority of these HSA members, approximately 82% of them, they were enrolled in an account through a large employer. So as patient obligation increases, managing the life cycle of a claim becomes more and more critical to ensure that you're getting the highest reimbursements out of that payer. And finally, payers have identified narrow networks as the most effective way to change the medical loss ratio, and they seem to have made this a key tactic to increasing their profitability. And there's a suit in California that's winding its way through federal courts right now, accusing Anthem and its Blue Cross entities of paying out-of-network patients directly in an effort to put pressure on healthcare providers to join their network and to accept lower payments. Critics say it's a revenge tactic against doctors, hospitals, and treatment facilities, and just any other medical provider that doesn't agree to insurance companies' demands to be in network. And these payers, they're making the providers, chase down the money. Now, as it relates to ASCs, the general consensus points to significant growth in this provider segment. Across the board, there is a strong current that points towards growth in the number of facilities, growth in the types of procedures, and the volume of procedures that are being performed. So you can see the full list on this slide, thanks to the folks at Becker's, but generally we are seeing a growth in outpatient surgeries across some of the largest specialties. So some of these specialties include orthopedics, spine, GI, gynecology, and even ophthalmology. Now, you may have heard about the battle to legislate away surprise billings, but from where we sit, it's more of an issue of the payers over the PR battle, and it should not have a major effect on ASCs, because generally speaking, surprise bills, they occur only in a few situations. So the first is when a patient receives treatment from an in-network surgeon, but an out-of-network anesthesiologist, for instance. So So the patients, they assert that they shouldn't have to pay the provider because they weren't aware that the anesthesiologist was out of network. Now, a second situation occurs when an out-of-network emergency department surgeon provides treatment and the patient doesn't know that they're out of network. Again, the patients assert that they shouldn't pay because the patient didn't know that they were being treated by an out-of-network provider. So the solution for these very specific cases is the establishment of payment standards. So it can either be in the form of capping the payments at in-network rates or to a percentage of Medicare. Or you can even establish some sort of mediation that will determine payments. But most ASCs won't be greatly affected by surprise billings because they just simply don't encounter emergency situations. Just ensure that if you are an in-network facility utilizing an out-of-network provider, that the patient is fully informed prior to surgery. John?
Thank you, Richa. Despite the payer's efforts to use tools such as narrow networks, as Richa described, to reduce out-of-network reimbursements, the out-of-network market has grown to over $60 billion in the last several years, and it continues to expand with no signs of showing. Since out-of-network will continue to be an important piece of the reimbursement landscape, it's critical that you make sure you are positioned to achieve success by leveraging best practices, being persistent, and bringing in experts who will help you maximize your reimbursements. Remember, when done right, out-of-network reimbursement management is one of only a few ways that you can improve your reimbursements as well as your bottom line. So as providers look at the landscape today, there are very few opportunities, fewer than ever, to improve their revenue profile. In-network contracts are set with very little opportunity to move the needle with respect to the reimbursement rates. With respect to Medicare and Medicaid, it's literally impossible to move the needle. Out-of-network represents the last great opportunity for many providers to improve their reimbursement levels overall. However, without a strong understanding of the processes and procedures in place to maximize reimbursements, providers run the risk of spending a lot of time, energy, and effort without getting any results. They don't get the benefits of a diversified payer mix strategy. So how can you avoid the pitfalls associated with implementing an out-of-network program and ensuring that your efforts are realized and increase reimbursements? Well, today we're going to be covering the top 10 best practices for engaging with payers and getting the reimbursements you deserve. So let's talk about best practice number one, to make sure that you have in place a rigorous appeal process. Now, appeals occur when a payer reprices a bill to a lower amount than you were willing to accept. When that happens, you appeal to the payer in an attempt to obtain a second payment. From the insurance company's perspective, they're done. They've satisfied their obligation. They made a determination of what reasonable and customary was and made the payment. Now it's up to the provider to convince them to change their minds. The process to appeal an underpayment and obtain a higher reimbursement can be very labor intensive, but the best practice process is as follows. First, starting with the intake, ensure that you have the documentation necessary to handle the claim, including the assignment of benefits, the bill itself, and any notes or relevant documentation. Next is payer verification. That's where you contact the payer to verify the patient and bill information and obtain a verbal explanation for the basis of the underpayment. Next is strategy development. You need to put together the appropriate strategy for a given case. What are the facts you're going to present? What are the arguments you want to present? And if you have the data, using the data to support your argument. Now again, at CollectRx, we leverage the data and analytics from Crixus to support our position. Then engage with the payer. Present those facts, present those arguments. A lot of times it's really persistence that is the key. You need to make calls, write letters, understand how to escalate the bill up to and including the state insurance commission. Once you further present the information to the payer will typically wait a few weeks while they consider their decision. And so finally, if you are successful, you'll need to follow up to make sure you get paid correctly. Sometimes you are paid correctly, sometimes you're not paid correctly, but you need to make sure that you are. The second best practice is to have the data to support and prove that the payer's payment is inadequate. You need to be able to argue that the payer's reimbursement levels are inconsistent with your own history, and preferably with the history of other providers in the community. Now, from a data perspective, the payers and the vendors, they know a lot about you. They have databases that track every past negotiation. They know very specifically how they want to deal with you. When an out-of-network bill is received by a payer, they have the names, the titles, the phone numbers of your business office staff with notes, literally, that say things like, don't go to Mary, she'll only give you a 20% discount. Go to Bill, he'll give you a 40% discount. So some of the key points, data points that they know about you include who on your staff has the authority to grant various levels of discounts, who gives the largest discounts and who to avoid, and how large a bill needs to be before they contact the CFO or the administrator. The third best practice is to have a well-drafted assignment of benefits. Now, an assignment of benefits puts you in the shoes of the patient in terms of pursuing the payer to get the appropriate reimbursement. Now, we're not offering any legal advice here today, but there are a few things you want to keep in mind as you put together your assignment of benefits yourself or with the help of a consultant or lawyer. First, you want to make sure it assigns the provider all rights under the insurance policy, that it maintains the right to appeal and the right to receive relevant documentation, refers to the provider as the patient's authorized representative for the claim, references ERISA and a full and fair review of claims. If an AOB is inadequate, it's another roadblock that the payers can use to stop you from getting reimbursed properly on your out-of-network bill. In fact, at a sort of 50-foot level, much of the payer strategies are built around this idea of putting up enough roadblocks to convince you to give up and to walk away. Best practice number 4 is don't take the short turnaround times for granted. When the vendors opt to settle cases through single case rate agreements, they often do so by sending proposals that have a very short turnaround time for a response. Their goal is to put pressure on the provider to settle quickly in hopes that they will feel the pressure to do so. But these turnaround times really are real some of the time, but are not real a lot of the time. Next best practice, number 5, is to avoid third-party contracts. Now, the vendors sell contracts to to providers all the time that promise these great rates. The catch here, though, is that they apply various cuts, like UNC and multiple procedure reductions to these rates. So many times your final reimbursement rate is just a fraction of what you had expected. Now, even if you have a third-party contract, let's say at a rate of 65%, payers can still attempt to negotiate a lower amount than that rate. And if they can't negotiate a lower rate, they'll just take the 65%. As such, the contract is really acting like a cap on your reimbursement. Best practice number 6 is to read your documentation carefully. Payers are constantly looking for ways to underpay these out-of-network providers in order to save money, and they're very successful in doing so because most providers don't take the time to read documents and really understand how they were reimbursed. So if you still decide to have a third-party contract after hearing this, you need to check your documentation to ensure that the payer reimbursed you at the contracted rate, because as mentioned in the last slide, they will employ various cuts to reduce your reimbursements. Given the difficulty, it's understandable why providers don't take the time to read their documents. They're very time-consuming, but it's necessary to do so if you want to have a successful out-of-network strategy. Best practice number 7 is to seek retro authorizations. Sometimes you can get an authorization after the fact. Sometimes you can't, but you really have nothing to lose. So you should, if you have a claim that's denied on these grounds, it's worth it to take the chance to see if you can get it overturned. Best practice number 8 is what we call the persistence game. Ultimately, in a lot of what we've been talking about here, it's really the battle of the wills between you and the payers and vendors. They are putting up obstacles to success and banking, sort of literally banking, that you will get fed up and walk away. Their goal is to get you to throw in the towel. They know that you're busy. They know that you don't have the time. They know that you don't have the data. So they take the process, make it as difficult as possible for you. So you have to be very persistent in order to get what you deserve. The next practice, best practice, number 9, is understanding that the payers are not your friends. We hear providers all the time tell us that they have a great relationship with the vendors, and that's exactly what the vendors want you to believe. You just got to remember they're not your friend. They're continually trying to find new ways not to pay you more money on behalf of their clients, the insurance companies. Best practice number 10 is to consider outsourcing. Even if the provider has the skills, expertise, and data to be successful in improving their out-of-network reimbursements, generally it's difficult to manage the time required to fight for the appropriate reimbursements. And think about this from a payer perspective. Major insurance companies worth billions of dollars who have vast amounts of money, resources, and data at their disposal. What do they do here? They outsource. So you should at least consider that approach as you put together your strategy. And let me address one last sort of bonus best practice. And the single most important thing you can do to maximize reimbursements and revenue is to implement a full revenue cycle management program that's designed to handle complex claims that include out-of-network. Working with out-of-network patients can have a tremendous impact on your top and bottom lines if you know how to manage each step in the process, from pre-arrival processing to scheduling, benefits verification to coding, billing, appeals, etc. Partnering with an ally in this who understands how this works, including the complex claims, is an important thing that you need to know in order to be successful and get the reimbursement levels you're entitled to. Richa?
All right, thanks, John. So I'll take it from here and discuss how you can build your program. And first off, what you need to do is understand your current out-of-network billing and collections. So get a complete audit of your past 12 months in claims to determine any areas of opportunity and where you can appeal and increase your payment. At CollectRx, what we do when we begin with a customer is we use our Crixus Business Intelligence Engine to analyze all of their out-of-network activity over the past year and identify appealable cases. And it's a complementary analysis. It determines if any money has been left on the table and what the potential is to recuperate on those payments. I mean, it's a pretty simple process that starts with running a patient payment report from their billing system, and it ends with CollectRx's proprietary appeals method to find providers more money. Next, you need to clearly understand each step in your revenue cycle process in order to quickly discover, correct, and prevent deficiencies across the board. Because by understanding your workflow, you can tailor dynamic, flexible processes to ensure that you're maximizing your reimbursements across all payers and all claim types. And whether it's by partnering with experts in each of the complex claim areas that you're engaged in, or training your staff and equipping them with ongoing professional developments, or even hiring experts in reimbursement strategies, managing out-of-network and complex claims relies on a thorough understanding of current and ongoing policies. It's difficult, but there is a great opportunity if you can take advantage of it. So to maximize your reimbursements, just make sure that you coordinate your resources, you utilize your data, and you make sure you have the expertise and commitment to fighting for the highest reimbursements possible. John?
So just summing up here, we hope you leave today with a better understanding of what's happening with respect to out-of-network, and also that you remember that when done right, proper out-of-network reimbursement management is one of the only ways providers can improve financial performance.
Excellent.
All right, thanks, Laura.
Thank you both, John and Risha, so much for this fantastic presentation. I wanted to let you know that we do have time for a few questions, so if you are able to enter your questions into the space labeled Enter Question for Staff and click Send, we will be able to do that. First of all, I do have a question here, and the first question is, what are the biggest things ASCs do to negatively impact their out-of-network revenue?
This is John. Let me take that. One of the things that we see very often, and frankly more often than we'd like to see, is that the providers simply forget to bill. And I know that sounds so simple, but I can't tell you how many times we are working with a client or a prospective client, and they're questioning why their collections are down, and it's just basically they forgot to bill.
And yeah, and I want to add to that too, because there's we see providers negotiating these out-of-network bills, and they're getting some additional payments on some cases, but they're not successful in getting the fullest amount just because they lack data, you know, keeping track of their own cases, what they've negotiated in the past, and even what's in the area. And then also resources. I mean, a lot of, you know, billing offices are short-staffed, or they just don't have the resources to commit to, you know, for example, appealing an out-of-network bill, which could take months. So I just want to add that also as an issue that can negatively impact out-of-network revenue.
That's a great answer, and I know our audience will be appreciative of hearing your great expertise. Our next question here is, my state is getting more challenging. Are there any states where it doesn't make sense to do out-of-network?
I guess the first thing to recognize here is that, you know, out-of-network really, for the most part, isn't driven from a state perspective. It's really the employer's policies and what they dictate. But with that said, you know, while it can vary from geographic location one to the other, there's out-of-network opportunity basically nationwide.
That's a great point. And then our next question here, given that I'm in a third-party agreement, what is the best way to negotiate? Do I have any leeway to get higher reimbursements?
No, you're stuck in those contracts. So if you're in if you're in a third-party contract, you are you don't have the ability to negotiate. You can't get higher reimbursements. If you're taking an out-of-network strategy, it's usually a mistake to engage in one of these contracts, because in the end, what they do is they cap your reimbursements, kind of like you have a managed care contract. And because of that, you no longer have any negotiating power.
Got it. Thank you so much for that, Richa. Our next question here is, I'm not currently seeing a lot of out-of-network. Is it worth it for me to start seeing more out-of-network patients in my practice, and how can I do it?
Yeah, that's sort of akin to the question I just addressed a moment ago. Yes, it's worth it to see more out-of-network patients. Reimbursement levels tend to be higher in out-of-network than with respect to in-network. I mean, frankly, to give you sort of a complete answer, though, would take longer than what we have here today. As Laura mentioned at the beginning, if you have a question about this or other topics that we discussed, you know, we'd be happy to discuss them with you.
Perfect. And we have time for one more question here. Our last question is there any way to recover any of my prior underpayments now?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about that during my part of the presentation, and I was talking about how you can audit your payments over the past year. We do that for our clients. So if you want to learn more about that, you know, we can definitely discuss that offline as well.
Well, thank you so much, John and Richa, for the fantastic presentation. This is all the time we have today. I again want to thank our webinar sponsor, CollectRx. We hope you have a great rest of your day and can join us for future webinars.